What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 204. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone, joined by Connor Freeman today. Connor, how's it going?
I'm great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Hope you're gonna have a good Christmas this week, Connor. And with Christmas week, I don't want to say there's necessarily a slowdown in the news, but just more people are on vacation, even within the government. So there's less press conferences. There's fewer reporters working. People have written stuff ahead of time and things like that. And so, but at the same time, things are still developing. And in fact, it's a time really important to keep your eye on the news, because if something sneaky is trying to happen, it's a perfect time to do it when people generally are paying less attention. At the same time, harder maybe to ramp up towards the war when like the bigger name TV host aren't there, the ones that will always toe the line, everything like that. John Brennan's in the Bahamas or something like that. He's on CNN the week before Christmas. But me and Connor are here, and we're going to be breaking down what's happening with Russia, China, and Iran. So it probably won't be as heavy and dense as the shows we've had on these three in the past couple of weeks, but certainly a lot of important news to talk about. Another round of Iran talks hopefully coming up. Connor will have what's happening in the last ones, and then tensions on the border with Russia and Ukraine, and tensions over China. So Connor, before we get into it, just remind people where they could find the show. Conflicts of Interest is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle, for a full archive of the show and the daily news roundup that I write. Connor is one of the main columnists that we have at the Libertarian Institute, and so either if you listen, click on one of his articles, then click on his name, and you'll get the full archive that way. Or if you just keep your eye on the featured article section, anytime something new comes up, you'll see Connor, as well as our other great writers like Sheldon Richman and Hunter DeRensis, Lori Calhoun. So tons of great content in the featured articles section at the Libertarian Institute. And then I'm the opinion editor at antiwar.com, so check that out. And find the show on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble for video version. And then we post on social media at Twitter and Facebook. Donations, Patreon, Subscribestar, and then the crypto information is in the show notes page. And another way you could help the show and help yourself out, maybe some short days here, not getting as much of the good vitamin D, spending time outside and everything like that. Get yourself some CBD. Tons of great ways it could help your health and, improve just how you're feeling, less anxious, less depressed, help you to sleep at night, or, physical health. You're feeling a little stiff and everything like that. Take some of the CBD pills with curcumin, work absolutely excellent. Or I really like the sports cream with the menthol. So whatever you like over at Paloma Verde, just make sure you use the promo code PEACE when you check out, PEACE. Save yourself 25% off and get the show kit back. All right, Connor, let's get into it, and we'll start with news on Russia today. I think the most important thing that's happening, and this is from actually Voice of America, so this is official U.S. government propaganda. If you look at the headline, no signs of Russia de-escalating on Ukraine border, well, that sounds like we need a concern about war, but actually, if you go through and read what's in this article, Connor, the U.S. intelligence officials say Putin hasn't decided whether he's invading Ukraine or not. But more importantly, they say Russia still has between 70 and 100,000 troops deployed in the general border region with Ukraine. Now, the reason this is important is that this was the intelligence estimate from the administration in November, too, about this many troops deployed. And in fact, there's been times they actually claimed it was over 100,000. And so I'm not saying that Russia actually moved troops out, but just that it doesn't seem like they're moving more troops into the region. And also the U.S. has said that, Russia's invasion force would be 175,000 troops. And so, if you look at the possibility that they're actually on the low range of this estimate, Connor, at like 70,000, 75,000 troops, they're not even halfway to the force the U.S. thinks they would need to invade Ukraine. And so, in a lot of ways, if you're looking at what's happening in the media, the rhetoric is very hawkish. The spin is very hawkish. We're on the brink of war. Russia is being so aggressive. But then, Connor, if you actually look at what's happening here, I don't think it's so concerning. And then the U.S. intelligence kind of putting this out, I don't know, seems like while tensions are certainly hot, and I'm not saying we don't have to worry anymore about things, Connor, they don't seem to be escalating anymore, at least not practically what's happening on the ground. Whether the rhetoric is escalating or not is a different story. But, I thought that was important to just set the tone for everything else we're going to talk about, is it doesn't actually seem from the Russian side of the border there's any kind of buildup that's been going on over generally the past month. I don't know if you've read anything about maybe Russia, actually moving more assets into the region, Connor, but other than I think I saw maybe them conducting some exercises in Belarus with nuclear-capable bombers, which I think is mimicking kind of some drills that NATO has carried out recently. It doesn't seem like there's really any sign that Russia is ramping things up at all and has kind of leveled out from where they were in early to mid-November.
Yeah, that's what I've been seeing. It's been pretty consistent over the last month, except it does seem like the Americans seem to be kind of, slowly stepping back, as you covered on the previous show on Russia, from what their previous threats to get involved.
Yeah, and so I just want to add a couple more things. This was interesting. It's from David Ignatius at the Washington Post. So, there may be some truthiness to this article, but one of the things that's apparently being discussed in the Biden administration is how they would support an anti-Russian insurgency in Ukraine, assuming that Russia invades and takes over the country. And my concern, Connor, isn't necessarily that these plans will ever come to fruition, because I really think it's very unlikely that Russia invades Ukraine and takes over any substantial part of the country that the U.S. could really back an insurgency in. We can't back an insurgency in the Donbass because there's not enough American sympathy, Western sympathy in that region. But, maybe in the other parts of Ukraine, there could be that potential. But it seems unlikely that Russia would go all the way and take Kiev, although, if that came about, then maybe they would use these plans. But I guess my bigger concern with this one, Connor, is just that the Americans would look at this and then they would start to plan ahead and give the Ukrainians more and more weapons and stuff like that in preparation to fight this insurgency that may never come about. And then that could prompt the Ukrainians, of course, to do something with those weapons aggressive against Russia. So, I don't know how much truth there is to that article, but I just thought it was worth generally mentioning. We also had the U.S. And other NATO allies carry out the combined resolve war games. 4,600 soldiers from 12 companies got together in Ukraine for that. I guess, Connor, I kind of doubt that, there's anything particularly inflammatory about these war games. Of course, I think Russia will continue to just take it as like the slow trickle and buildup of NATO and Western forces and weapons in Ukraine. For essentially the past year, Russia has been alleging that the U.S. is using these war games as cover to smuggle more and more weapons to the Ukrainians. And so there's also reports from Germany that NATO is considering sending more weapons to Romania and Bulgaria. While this wouldn't be as provocative maybe as sending the weapons to one of the Baltic states or Ukraine, countries that actually border NATO, these are Black Sea countries, and, a buildup in definitely within Russia's sphere of influence. Now, Connor, probably the most noteworthy thing going on with Russia from the past week, though, of course, is Putin's proposal to the Americans. Now, there is a really good article by Gilbert Dothero at antiwar.com on this that provides a really comprehensive breakdown. It is a longer article, so, if you got the time, go sit down, read the Dothero article. I definitely recommend it. I'm going to be summarizing it. If you just got a shorter amount of time, Moon of Alabama, I think, does a pretty good job of breaking down the proposal with, far fewer words. So generally speaking, what the U.S. or what Russia is asking for, and I think they put together two proposals. One would be between the U.S. and Russia, and then the other one would be between Russia and NATO. And I guess, in a sense, probably, Connor, only one of these things needs to get done, but of course the U.S.-Russia one would be far more important. And so the proposal for the U.S.-Russian one and the U.S. Or the Russia-NATO one, it very much mimics this and is largely similar, and that is no more NATO expansion towards Russia's borders, retraction of the 2008 NATO invitation to Ukraine and Georgia, legally binding guarantee that no strike systems which could target Moscow will be deployed in countries next to Russia. And my guess, Connor, is they would interpret that to include Poland, but maybe that is something that could be debated. No NATO or equipment exercises near NATO's border. Again, this could be something that is debatable, like if the Black Sea is going to be included in this. But certainly I think they would say Ukraine and the Baltic states, and probably, more or less Poland, or at least the portion of Poland that is close to the border with Russia. And then NATO ships, planes to keep certain distances from Russian borders, regular military to military talks, no intermediate range nukes in Europe. And so, I don't know, Connor, I would guess that would be pretty reasonable and a pretty good way to ramp down tensions. However, it does come off, especially for people who just, pay attention to the U.S. mainstream, as very maximalist demands from Russia. And so, there are some people who are claiming that this is basically what Putin is proposing in order to give himself cover to invade Ukraine. Basically, you make a set of demands that can't possibly be met, and then when the other side refuses talks, you throw your hands in the air and you say, well, the only option left is military, and then you go and you invade Ukraine. Now, that seems a whole lot like projection from the American side. I mean, this is essentially the playbook they run on Iran every time. And a lot of other countries they deal with, like North Korea or Libya or something like that. However, I don't think that the Russian demands are that absurd. And also, if you look at the Russian behavior over the past 30 years, it hasn't been to make maximalist demands and then completely immediately go right to the military option. It's very much for negotiation and looking for a negotiating partner. And so it'll be interesting to see how this develops. If Russia is really saying that, no, these are all red lines, and if you were unwilling to negotiate on any of them, or if this is more of, a couple of these things are red lines, a couple of these things we're willing to cave on, and we're willing to take a middle road on a couple. Or, if you give us these red lines, we will make some other concessions on various, there's a lot of things that could be up for debate here. And so hopefully this does facilitate. Now, if you want to read some good commentary on these talks, I recommend Ray McGovern's article, Putin has a big brother and Xi. This is talking about the Russian-China relationship that Ray has been writing on a lot recently. And I think he has a very, very important perspective. I guess, the only thing I would say, and Ray is really pointing out and arguing that the U.S. Position has gotten so hostile towards Russia and China, has pushed the two together. And I definitely think that's the case. Now, how much that's solidified and how much things would change if, the U.S. adopted a new foreign policy could certainly be thought about. But in the sense of what I think the U.S. is going to continue to do, I think Ray McGovern is essentially right, Connor. While, it's not exactly set that this has to be the way that the future is going to play out, it certainly seems that the course we're going on, this is the way the future is going to play out. And there's not much indication something that would go a different way. And then Pat Buchanan also has an article titled "What to Do About the Russian Ultimatum," and just another very, very good article with Pat's great take that he's had for a long time on the Russia issue that I recommend people check out. But we have to break it all down on this show. But go ahead, and I'd like to hear what you thought were maybe the highlights of those articles, Connor.
Sure. So, Pat quotes an American official in there who I believe is anonymous, but they've quoted an American official because Rabkov met in Moscow with Karen Donfried, the Assistant Secretary of State, and I guess that would have been at the end of last week, like on Friday, and then the Russians spelled out the details, I guess, around Friday or over the weekend. Anyway, either way, it was last week. So an American official has been quoted saying that now obviously some of these are not particularly negotiable. However, there are things that we definitely would like to talk with the Russians about, and that could be. It was basically like what you were saying, where it's sort of it's. The Americans, like you said, always try to frame, especially with whether it's Iran or Russia or whatever, that they're making maximalist demands. But the truth is that the Americans sort of, as we look at, and we'll see this with Iran too, they reach a certain point where they ramp up the rhetoric and the buildup so much, kind of the way that you said they paint Russia this way, but they kind of hit a brick wall where it's like, okay, well, are you really going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine right now? Because Russia's not going to go to war. It's not going to try and take Kiev anyway, unless you try to take Ukraine into NATO. So it's just very interesting that the Americans, it's obviously not, Ukraine is not nearly as important. And as Pat always points out, it's not nearly as important to the Americans as it is to the Russians. So, and I saw that Pat said that they're also demanding that, in addition to Ukraine and Georgia, that they don't bring Armenia or Azerbaijan into NATO. They also talk about taking now, he says that they also have requested to take military infrastructure out of Eastern Europe that they've been putting in the region since 1997, before they even brought in like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, I believe, in 99. And then there was a huge ramp up of expansion under Bush in 2004, particularly with the Baltic states. And some of the other states on the Black Sea, like Bulgaria and Romania. But yeah, so it's just interesting because the Americans have put themselves in this situation where as you said, you said you weren't sure if they were talking about, when they say take your weapons out of this region near our borders, if they're talking about countries on the Black Sea. But there's a lot of expansion going on over there. I believe in Romania they have over $150 million they're investing in construction at I think it's called Camp Terzi, a former Soviet base, expanding capabilities of Black Sea. And all year that's been particularly the emphasis is on expanding America and NATO's capabilities in the Black Sea, which is extremely critical to Russia as far as its ability to project power in the region. So, and to defend itself from increasing encroachment. So I would imagine, like I was just going to say, if the shoe was on the other foot, the Americans would insist that would at least have to be on the table. The idea that you can't just be constantly flying, bombers and sailing ships into the Black Sea. And I think that's what they said. And I think, as Pat points out, the Russians, it sounds like they're saying, look, if you don't, because they have been sending planes and naval vessels near Alaska and Hawaii, for instance. And it's clearly in retaliation to, decades of aggression against Russia, particularly with NATO as the spearhead. So, but they've said like it's essentially a mutual freeze on that kind of activity. So all these different requests that they have made, if the shoe was on the other foot, would sound totally reasonable. And I think if more Americans could sort of be able to do that, to have that sort of empathetic view and put yourself in the Russian shoes, I think it's pretty obvious that these are things we shouldn't be in this position in the first place. But the demands that they're making are very reasonable. And I thought what Ray was talking about, which is that the more and more America's policy pushes China and Russia together, it increases the weight of the demands from both sides, from the Russians and the Chinese, because They do not have a formal alliance because, as Ted Snyder points out, they're reluctant to, as they say, that one of their big criticisms of the Americans in NATO is that, and particularly Biden, is that he's dividing the world into these Cold War blocs and alliances, and dividing up the world, and even they would like to drive a wedge between Russia and China. But as Ray McGovern points out, it's having the opposite effect. All their different policies, and that they seem to be behind the times, thinking this is like the 70s or something.
Right.
So it's very it's interesting because the way it works is, as Ted says, they're making it clear to the Americans that they're not going to have two Cold Wars with Russia and China, or a Cold War with Russia or China. If they have a Cold War with Russia, they'll be in conflict with China, and vice versa. If they go after China, they're going to have to deal with Russia too. So like I said, I think it adds extra weight to their demand. And I think the Americans, probably if even a few years ago, if the Russians had made demands like this, would have laughed and said these are non-starters and refused. But it sounds like there was a report in your news roundup today from Reuters. They said that talks are to begin early next year. Is that what it said?
Yeah, so that's what I was going to go to next, is that we did have apparently contacts beginning, this is talks to set up talks. And, who knows how detailed this is, because sometimes talks to set up talks means, talking about what you're going to talk about, which is important. And sometimes it just means, well, what hotel in Russia will we be staying at, and what will the COVID testing policy, and how many assistants can each one of our diplomats bring, and can the personal chef and the dog walker come? The last part's kind of a joke, but seriously, like, those are like some of the complications that happen when figuring out, the size of delegations, security. Now that COVID's a thing, that too. But Russia says they want an urgent response for the security proposals, and so, one thing that's really bothered me, Connor, it isn't necessarily that there are in-person meetings happening, because I do think it's important for, say, Biden to meet with Putin in person. But, there is like Zoom now, right? And so, like, world leaders have had conversations, through video chat. I'm sure they don't actually use Zoom, but they have these conversations on video chat, and so it doesn't necessarily take a very complicated, long, drawn-out process to start to set up these talks, especially since the important thing is a lot of work to get actually done behind the scenes, as like Peter Van Buren has pointed out in the past. When it comes to diplomacy, all the work that's done behind the scenes needs to happen, so that when Trump meets with Kim Jong-un, or Biden meets with Vladimir Putin, or Raisi, or whoever, a deal could be signed, but a lot of the diplomatic work gets done in the background well before they ever actually get to any two world leaders even getting together. And so it would be very unfortunate, I guess, if we decide it's going to take until mid-January to set up times to meet, which it isn't unreasonable. It's a trip to Russia during COVID, trying to figure out who's going, and probably not much is going to happen until like the second or third of the year after holidays, people get back from work and all that kind. All this makes absolute sense, but at the same time, a lot of conversations could be happening between now and then. That way, once the in-person meetings start, they know where they're focusing, how close the proposals are, and all that. So I hope.
Did they say they were planning on meeting in Geneva? I know I saw the Russians saying we're ready to meet in a third country tomorrow, and then I think it was one of the, might have been Putin's aide or his form. I don't know if it was his national security advisor or just another like Kremlin spokesman, but they said we're ready to meet in a third country tomorrow, and then it said literally tomorrow. But I saw something about they're planning on meeting in Geneva.
Yeah, I mean, there could still be like U.S. and Russian officials there from Iran talks or something like that, and so that could be part of the reason why. Also, I don't know where the talks happened in Geneva or between who, but at some point in the past couple of months, Russia thought that they had made some progress with U.S. officials having talks in Geneva on the diplomacy issue. And then when those talks went higher level, it doesn't seem like it really worked out. But maybe Russia is suggesting Geneva because they feel like there's like a receptive American official there who's, not completely incompetent and ignorant of the world. All right, so Connor, the last thing I want to mention on, two more things. The first is just that Poland and Lithuania are joining Ukraine and calling for sanctions against Russia. They're basically saying that, the Biden plan of sanctioning Russia once they invade Ukraine is stupid because once they invade Ukraine, they expect to be sanctioned. And so, it's really not a threat. And so that you should sanction Russia now. And while I don't agree with sanctioning Russia now, I guess, I kind of do sympathize with Ukraine, feeling like it would definitely be too late for them if the U.S. waits until after Russia invades. So I don't know. I don't see another heavy round of sanctions being placed on Russia in the short term. I don't think the U.S. is going to kick Russia out of SWIFT or sanction the Nord Stream 2 pipeline or anything like that again in the short term. Although, I guess the one asterisk I will put on that, Connor, is I read today that Ted Cruz was really attempting to leverage some of his votes to get a vote on the Nord Stream pipeline. And so, it does seem like something congressional hawks would be willing to go for in order to be more hawkish on China or something like that, or to get, Ted Cruz to vote for some of their Senate ambassadorships or something like that. But the last story on Russia is just this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. China-Russia pledged to reduce reliance on U.S.-led financial system. U.S. sanctions have naturally drawn China and Russia to work on building a more robust trade relationship. Dave writes, and this is from about a week ago, December 16th, during talks on Wednesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi vowed to step up efforts to establish an independent trade network to reduce reliance on the U.S.-led financial system. And they go on to, talk about this is mainly SWIFT. Facing similar pressure, China and Russia have boosted their trade relationship. During Wednesday's call, Xi said trade between the two nations topped $100 billion this year for the first time. The leaders also went on to make fewer transactions with the U.S. dollar and using the Chinese yuan or the Russian ruble. And this is something I've, basically been predicting / warning about for 4 years, Connor, on the show, which is if you sanction the entire world, the world is just going to ignore your sanctions because, they're not going to say, oh, we still got to worry about running afoul of U.S. sanctions if literally everything you do gets a sanction. And so, when we look at China, the U.S. has gone heavy on sanctions in the past couple of weeks. The Senate passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. We broke down on the show last week, so I'm not gonna, do a full breakdown on it again. But essentially, this bill is going to ban most products from coming from Xinjiang, China, to the United States. There were some serious U.S. Industry that lobbied against this, including Coca-Cola, because they import goods from this region, but the U.S. says that there's concentration camps there and forced Uyghur labor. We've broken down on the show, and Pat McFarland, our colleague at the Libertarian Institute, has done great work on this issue. I'm sure there are abusive labor practices. I'm sure I wouldn't want to work in the conditions of the factories in Xinjiang, China. I'm not saying this is working anywhere in the U.S. or anything like that, even maybe an Amazon warehouse to compare it to. But at the same time, life isn't that great in Xinjiang, China. It's an impoverished area of the world. A lot of China is poor. It's not just the Uyghurs that are poor. And so, I think it's far more complicated than just to say these are concentration camps and we have to ban all goods from there. Now, my understanding is that at least before this passed the Senate, the Biden administration's plan was to sign this bill. I don't know if, they actually go through with it or what happens.
I think it said they welcomed it after the Senate passed
Okay.
it. There was some
So then
quote
they
from
will
the
go through
administration
and go ahead and sign
indicating,
it.
yeah, that they support
Yeah,
it.
I had read that was the case before the House passed it, but sometimes they bluff. They think Joe Manchin, but of course, something like this, I'm sure they knew that it was going to pass. I think it had quite a bit of support. The U.S. also has been just blacklisting a bunch of Chinese firms and individuals. These sanctions have come from the Biden administration, like the White House, the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, and have targeted different areas and parts of China. And some people have actually been double sanctioned or more. And this does actually change the status, though. Sometimes it doesn't matter, but in this case, it does, because the U.S. had sanctions on Chinese officials that, prevented U.S. businessmen from doing business with China, but wouldn't necessarily prevent a second foreign country from doing business with the sanctioned people in China. But now, we've put them on different blacklists. And so 5 people in China were added to the blacklist for violating human rights, quote unquote, in Hong Kong. And so now the U.S. is threatening secondary sanctions against anyone who trades with those people. So understand that this is a really complicated world that, if you're in global finance, I mean, it must be an absolute mess if you're doing business with China. Just, it's constantly evolving who's on the sanctions list, what company is. I don't think they're very accurate on, who they actually blacklist or not. There's no due process, really. I mean, companies have sued to try to get off of them, saying that it's based on false information, all that. And usually it's, or almost always, I don't know of any case there's actually been a success. But, to try to, again, figure out, oh, I could do business with this person this week, even though they're sanctioned, but next week they're still sanctioned, but now I can't do business with them. And just a huge mess, and it has to cause so much artificial poverty in the
I think
global wealth system. But go ahead, Connor.
Well, I was going to say, I think I've seen in Dave's reporting as well about Dave DeCamp that as far as the Xinjiang issue goes, and the risk about Xinjiang as well is as you're talking about how they make it more and more difficult for international businesses to work with China. But a big part of it, as well as the Hawks have been calling for decoupling and kind of you take this hard line sort of position and you put it out there into the zeitgeist, and then we don't decouple from China right away, but they start sort of testing that out in a way of now with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, they sort of test run decoupling from various regions of China, and then it's gonna get worse from here and there. And they talk about how they have to. It sounds like companies, like you said, Nike and Coca-Cola have disputed these claims. But you'd have to go through a process. They say that what does it say in the law, that they need to present clear and convincing evidence that they're not using forced labor. And what's interesting about that, so who knows how tedious and full of red tape and maybe even dishonest, I'm sure, that process would be. But Dave has pointed out that it sounds like the claims about these companies using forced labor, which they've complained about, are coming because they say they're from these third-party groups. I think Dave says that the claims come from this group called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is funded by Lockheed and other military industrial complex firms. So similar to the case of Adrian Zenz and these other sort of who comes from neocon think tanks, I believe the Jamestown Institute, you have all kinds of conflicts of interest, to borrow a phrase, where you have the military-industrial complex funding these claims about China, which only serve to ramp up tensions. And then, as we've discussed previously on the show, if you cut off trade with a country like China, it makes conflict so much more likely.
Right. And this is taking our, chipping away at the trade between the U.S. and China. And right now, the trade relationship is massive, but if you get rid of trade from this province and that province, and you ban trade with this sector and that sector, eventually it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and make the, you know, idea of potential war with China more and more likely. And also, there's just so much in the American zeitgeist right now that, you know, that these concentration camps just exist as something that everybody knows, that China's human rights abuses are the worst thing on the planet and the most intolerable thing on the planet and all that. And so it just, all this is just absolutely justified unquestionably.
I noticed in briefly, I noticed that Dave DeCamp mentioned on Scott on the Scott Horton show recently that there's a report out of the AP where they say that apparently people aren't in the camps that supposedly held like 1 million people, which I believe that statistic came from the NED, and it's you know, and Pat has covered where that comes from as well. I believe that it's very questionable. But what's funny is they now say that they're not in there. And I read a piece from Axios about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the way that they're, you know, previously, if you read a piece on China, especially regards to Xinjiang, they would offhand without citing, sort of like when they go Iran-backed Houthis, they don't feel like they have to hyperlink it. Whereas if I did something like that, well, I wouldn't do something like that, but I wouldn't get past an editor. But you can do that if you're in the mainstream. So anyway, they now they say, instead of saying there's 1 million people in these camps, they say where 1 million people are believed to have passed through the camp. Like, I just noticed how they're massaging the rhetoric now, because apparently, but as you said, in our culture here, like that's already a done deal. Like they just beat that into everybody's head. So everybody just assumes that there's, you know, 1 million people in concentration camps. And if you don't believe that, you're a CCP shill or something like that.
Yeah. A couple other stories on China before I get to the buying personnel here. The U.S. is apparently planning to build software that is going to predict China's response to military action. This is one of the more terrifying things that I have read in the past couple of weeks. Not necessarily because I think this software is going to predict that we need to go in nuclear war with China or something like that, but, you know, the people who build this software are not going to be people who work at the Quincy Institute or antiwar.com. They're going to be China haunts, and they're going to build the software to play out the scenario that they have and fantasize about in their heads, which seems awfully like to lead to war between the U.S. and China. And so I don't know how concerning that is, Connor, but it is fairly concerning that they're building this kind of system. Also, I do think there's, you know, kind of just a sense in America from the population that, you know, having a computer to back up your analysis is somehow like a justification for making a decision. So, you know, oh, the computer said that running this exercise through the Taiwan Strait wouldn't cause an issue with China, so not my fault, says the general in charge.
The reporting on this is weird too, because they're like, well, we thought we should do this after they complained so vocally after that passage to the Taiwan Strait the U.S. and the Canadians did a few months ago, and they always, the People's Liberation Army spokesman for you know, whatever, I think it's the I don't know if it's the Eastern Theater Command or what the full name, but they always come out and make a statement like that, where they'll say that the Americans are causing all this instability and are a threat to cross-strait peace, and are, you know, like I said, making the region much more dangerous than it needs to be. But it's very weird because if you read the reporting, they go, well, we're taking data from, you know, they're talking about sending congressional delegations to Taiwan, putting more and more military assets into the region, warplanes and warships, as we've been reporting on the show and talking about and writing about. And they also say that, you know, the passages through the Taiwan Strait, weapons sales, and how does China react? So they're going to make an algorithm based on how they've been reacting to these different American action and allied actions over the last year, you know, less than 2 years. As if, you know, like you said, there hasn't been a war yet. So I imagine the algorithm is going to play out where it's like, well, they'll, you know, that sounds very troubling, because it sounds like you could just justify continuing and maybe even escalating these policies because, frankly, the Chinese have been restrained so far with all these different actions. So based on what they've done in the past, you look at the exponential increase in activity. Biden has more than doubled the warplanes and spy planes around China and the South China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and the East China Sea. So the data from 2020 varies compared with 2021. So, and I expect things to only get worse in this vein next year. So, yeah, it sounds very, very troubling. And it sounds like they're just going to find a way to plug in an algorithm to suggest that we can keep doing whatever we want, basically, and get away with it.
Right. I do want to mention, Connor, that there was a meeting between U.S. and Chinese military officials this past week. And while it doesn't seem like any great news came out of it or anything, it's good that these meetings are happening. I want to talk about the Ping Shui situation just for a second. She's a Chinese tennis star that was, by the U.S. and Western media, alleged to have made accusations of sexual misconduct against a higher ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party, an older man, and then was, I guess, accused by the media of being hidden by the Chinese state, and basically, I don't know what they're quite saying, like she's being used by the Chinese Communist Party or anything, but she has now come out, and it's being portrayed in the American media as she is now walking back her her accusation of sexual assault against the older party official. And so I actually took the time, Connor, and I read 3 different translations of the statement that Peng Shui allegedly put on, I think it's called WeChat, the Chinese social network, or mainly Chinese social network. I don't know who all uses it around the world, but I think mostly is people in China. And so certainly, like, what happened between her and the official was gross behavior on his part, at the very least. You know, he's an older man. He has an appointment set up to play tennis with her. He's with his wife. And then after they play tennis, he makes a proposal to her to have a sexual relationship or something. I believe so. This is where like the translations get like a little different, but it sounds to me like, from, you know, reading it in English, what she is saying is that he made advances. She initially rejected him, and I think felt very conflicted about it, and felt like very disgusted, and like felt wrong because like his wife was on board, and this is a young woman with an older couple, right? So this is a weird situation for her to be in. Eventually she develops a sexual relationship with this guy, and there's a part where she says something about like something happened with the guard outside the door. Now this could in a way be read as, you know, I felt trapped, but if you actually read the statement, it sounds like what she is saying is like, I didn't expect like a romantic relationship to happen like this. And, you know, she in the letter lays out like positive aspects of their relationship, and a lot of it is, I think, her like feeling like basically this is an older man who showed a lot of attention on like an academic, you know, personal level, not just sexual level, to this young girl. But I think for him, it was like, if you read her letter, it seems like it was only sexual, right? Like he was just playing her. Like he was using her for sets, and like, you know, being like, you're so special, I'm going to teach you these, you know, great lessons in life, and mentoring with me is, and she has like this conflict because like she's like says something, am I a bad woman in there, because, you know, she's having an affair with a married man, and yet he's like, his wife's on board with it. Like, obviously this is a really terrible situation for her to be in. And I'm not saying that there's not issues with that kind of behavior, but if you're looking at like what's happening in the United States with like even the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, this woman isn't underage. And so even if this, you know, is predatory behavior, I don't even think if it happened in the United States, it would be considered illegal in any sense of the word. Again, gross. Yeah, I don't like it. And, you know, depending on where it was, between her being, you know, just easily influenced young woman being taken advantage of for sets versus, being groomed. I guess it sounds a little bit less like it from the letter that she put out. Just it doesn't. But maybe that's my misreading it. That was more, a shorter thing than her, like, slowly being groomed or anything like that. But again, I don't want to make any judgments, but certainly the U.S. mainstream media has bent what she initially put out into saying that this is China's Me Too, an accusation of sexual assault. And it's not clear that that's the case, and that's not clear what she's saying. And, they're really just taking advantage of this young woman's statement to demonize an entire society. And I'm sure, that has to make things even more difficult for her because, if she is somewhat of a Chinese patriot, I don't know. But let's say that she, doesn't like project this one CCP member's actions against her, even if they are the worst, onto the entire Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese society as the Americans would like you to have it. Then this could like be really harming her in the way of like you're taking her sexual abuse story and using it for your own political narrative. Maybe she feels like she can't come out and say I was sexually assaulted now, or give a more detailed statement because she feels like it would be used against her country. Right? Like this is really messed up what they're doing to this woman. And so, after she made the statement initially, I don't want to say like she disappeared or anything like that, but she didn't have a public appearance. Now, I have no idea how often, like any tennis star, I have no idea how often Serena Williams is in public. And I'm pretty sure it was Venus Williams, the older sister who like ran over somebody or was in a car accident and somebody ended up dying. But either way, it's a very serious car accident, right? If she was then like not seen in public for 2 weeks, I don't think that would be a scandal at all, right? This is a tennis player, not to like diminish female tennis in any way, but even like the Williams sisters, like aren't the biggest names in the United States, right? They're not Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or anything like that. And so I don't know. They made way too big of a deal about where she was. She made public statements. She talked to the IOC. She talked to the women's tennis players. I think it's the WTP. I don't know exactly what it stands for. And they keep saying, oh no, she's like being used by the CCP and they're brainwashing her or something. And I don't know. It all seems just very nefarious to me, Connor. And I don't have like again want to like draw some verdict and say like this is exactly what happened. I definitely know, but there's a lot more nuance than it's being portrayed in the U.S. mainstream media. I don't know if you have anything on this, or if you're a fan of women's tennis that I had no idea about, like why this woman is so important or anything like that.
No, I just noticed that it's. I mean, no, I'm glad you mentioned the Ghislaine Maxwell trial because it's like peak hypocrisy to be. They're really almost. As I saw Caitlin Johnstone interact with, or at least comment under Judd Apatow tweet. Where he quote tweeted the Associated Press talking about an article about her denial of some of these claims, and then he goes, "I'm scared for her," and she was like, "Believe all women unless not believing them helps promote Western imperial agendas," and this kind of thing. And it's just like, yeah, I mean, I've seen I believe Tim Pool and some of the mainstream sort of coverage of this, and it's all just extremely hyperbolic, and I don't know, it seems like it's just one more like lame story after another to use against China for all this stuff. But yeah, I think you essentially covered it. It's just I'm continue to be surprised how they can take a story like this and turn it into a major international incident and keep it going for like weeks and weeks.
Just real quick before we move on to Iran stuff here, Connor, I want to mention that Nicholas Burns was approved by the Senate to become ambassador to China. Rahm Emanuel was approved by the Senate to become ambassador to Japan. The biggest issue in his hearing was not anything to do with foreign policy, but his cover up of the police murdering. I believe his name was Laquan McDonald. If you remember, this is the video of the Chicago police officers, and this kid is, several yards away from the officers, and they shoot him, and Emmanuel helped cover up the killing. And then the last one here is the U.S. named the Undersecretary of State Yurza Zenya to be the special coordinator for Tibet. And the reason this is significant is it would be like China naming a special coordinator to Cherokee Nation or something like that. In that, China feels like this is an internal China issue. And, if China is, let's say, making a big stink about how Black Americans are unfairly treated in the inner cities, we fairly recognize it as hypocrisy. And, that being like kind of a silly complaint for China to make. Like, worry about your own human rights abuses before you come yelling about what happens in our prisons. Like, I'll complain about that just enough for you. Thank you very much, JJP. But at the same time, let's here, look at what's happening in Tibet and just make that the biggest deal in the world. So naming this woman the undersecretary will certainly probably ramp up tensions there. But Connor, let's move on and talk about Iran stuff. I don't know. We did have some thoughts this past week, but let's maybe start off with Karaja. I hope I'm saying that right. Karja facility, maybe.
I've been saying Karaj.
Karaj? Okay.
Yeah.
This facility is in Iran, and there is some nuclear activity that I guess takes place here, like that, all above board kind of stuff by Iran. And those cameras were damaged in an Israeli sabotage attack in June. And the IAEA has been demanding and complaining that Iran isn't in compliance because they won't put the cameras back. And Iran is saying, well, we'll put the cameras back if you blame the Israelis for it, which seems fairly sensible to me. But Connor, we finally got a deal to kind of resolve this. So what's happening here?
Yeah. So it's called the Tessa complex. They build centrifuges there. They don't operate them on site, which is one of the reasons why Iran has pointed out, and as Jason Ditz does here, that them doing this is purely voluntary, allowing the IAEA to reinstall these cameras, because. And I'll just point out that this had been going on for months. We've been covering this on the show, that Iran had continued to say to the IAEA, look, if you condemn this attack that the Israelis carried out with a drone, I believe it was on June 23rd. And I don't remember if I pointed this out on the previous show, but I have in my articles, and I think we covered this months ago. But that attack, it's notable that when the Times, I think it was a week ago or maybe 2 weeks ago, there was a piece out in the Times where they said that about sort of the Israeli pressure on America during vis-a-vis the deal, and then Trita Parsi wrote up something about it as well. We talked about, but what they said that the Israelis consulted Washington before the attack, and I kind of knew that because there was a military delegation that had been sent to Washington from Israel, and I think Aviv Kohavi was a part of it. But anyway, they sent a delegation to Washington to talk about Iran, and then talks ended on, I believe, the 20th, culminating around the time of the election of Ibrahim Raisi, and then this attack was carried out, I believe, on the 23rd. So it was nearly concurrent. But I'll just say that, so they've agreed to reinstall to allow the IAEA to reinstall the cameras. Now, from what I've seen, I sent you an article from Nor News, which is an Iranian outlet that I understand is apparently close to the National Security Council. But they claim that they did, and I've seen in other reports in Israeli media as well, that the Iranians apparently got the IAEA to condemn the attack. And in fact, the quote is, if you look at that article, they say, accordingly, and it's also interesting because it sounds like they had their own experts inspect the cameras before they were installed by the IAEA, because there had been accusations that previously the cameras that were there may have been used as to gather intelligence or to somehow play a role in the Israeli attack. So what it says here is accordingly, after finishing the main part of judiciary security investigations on damaged cameras, as well as IEA's condemning sabotage in the Karaj Tessa complex and accepting technical inspection of cameras by Iranian experts, before installation, Iran has voluntarily allowed the IEA to replace new cameras. Rafael Grossi, the IAEA chief, came out and said this agreement with Iran on replacing cameras at the Karaj facility is an important development for the IAEA's verification and monitoring activities in Iran. It will enable us to resume necessary continuity of knowledge at this facility, which this is also notable because we talked about last week that he did an interview with the Associated Press Monday or Tuesday of last week, I believe, and said because they didn't have this, the Europeans and the Americans and the IAEA made a huge deal out of them not replacing these cameras like it was the end of the world or something, particularly the Europeans. But now they're gonna. I thought you mentioned this on the show, and I think you're absolutely right. This was a smart move for Iran to do. I think you said that they might get together again on the additional protocol. It sounds like that there's not going to be a new monitoring agreement probably until presumably they restore or get or revive the JCPOA or at least get the Americans to return to the deal. But this was good optics for the Iranians because now they can know the Europeans and the Americans and Rafael Grossi and the IEA, cannot use this as rhetoric to say that Iran is like stonewalling them or something, which, they usually won't provide all the necessary context. The parliament passed a law as well saying that the Iranian parliament, that those recordings will not be accessible to the IAEA until, pending an agreement on the JCPOA and sanctions being lifted. And then there will be, of course, with that, like I said, the new monitoring agreement, maybe even maybe even they'll go back to the additional protocol and the snap inspections and that sort of thing. But right now it's under the footage is under joint control. But the reports I read from Noor News suggest that the footage will be right now it belongs to the Atomic Energy Association of Iran. But that they will be able to, the IAEA will be able to see it and get to the and have the footage after there's an agreement reached in Vienna. So that's about everything I have on what's going on with the IAEA. And then let's see. So as far as the talks go, the latest news is you have the Europeans coming out and suggesting that, they're kind of echoing American rhetoric, and they're saying that they put out a joint statement before the UN Security Council meeting last week, where we covered that the Secretary General of the UN said that he was going to push for a reimplementation for people to or for the nations, but he was basically saying that the Americans should roll back and put an end to these unilateral sanctions, and that there should be a real implementation of Security Council Resolution 2231. So I don't know. I guess to offset that, the Europeans came out and did the Americans' dirty work for them and came out and put out a very aggressive joint statement that said they accuse Iran of accelerating their nuclear program, curtailing IAEA monitoring, undermining international peace and security, walking back previously made compromises while presenting additional maximalist demands, which we've talked about before. They're mad because the Iranians are requesting more sanctions relief than the Americans are willing to grant them, and they want them to stick with these unofficial draft agreements that are full of brackets and were never fully agreed upon anyway, because the Americans were being dishonest negotiating partners and were insisting on basically they wouldn't agree to provide a guarantee that the Americans wouldn't leave the deal on a whim, even during the rest of the Biden administration. And which means that their promises of sanctions relief and would mean nothing, and Iran would end up giving up all their leverage in exchange for, presumably continued economic war and even threats of kinetic war. And they were insisting that the Iranians negotiate their independent foreign policy, their relationship with their allies in the region, and their ballistic missile deterrent, which was of course a non-starter. So from my understanding, is that the so-called hardliners of the Raisi government, their negotiating delegation is insisting on a full implementation of the JCPOA as it was written in 2015, which the Americans never granted them the sanctions relief that was promised in the deal. They even imposed more sanctions the day the deal was signed. So they've also talked about, as we've said here before, that they would like to see compensation for the damage done by the sanctions. And there's sort of an internal debate on whether to use that as leverage for talks, the demands for compensation, that is, and whether or not they should be asking to be repaid for the damage done after Trump left the deal, or even going back to, Obama, after the deal had been signed, sending around American representatives to strong-arm international businesses and financial institutions behind closed doors, telling them not to do business with Iran, and, saying one thing and doing another, directly contravening the deal itself. But the Europeans are putting out this very hostile statement. Now, they do say stuff like, there has been some technical progress in the last 24 hours, and I assume they're talking about the agreement to reinstall cameras in the Karaj facility. So again, I think that was a good move by the Iranians, because even their joint statement now seems, even if you by their spin, it seems out of date already. I got this report from Responsible Statecraft from Eldar Mamedov, who also talks about how they're saying that we're rapidly reaching, the end of the road. The JCPOA will be hollowed out because of Iran's nuclear advancements. And of course, there's these typical accusations. We'll get to more about because Robert Malley is making similar statements now, that they've been expanding their nuclear program as leverage. But that was already ongoing, and of course that was in response to so many, particularly the Israeli sabotage attacks at the Natanz facility, which is their main center for building centrifuges, and also, of course, their attacks on Iranian ships and things, and increasing American sanctions and threats. So, but they're trying to paint, to this day, they're still trying to paint. When they say that, I assume they're talking about the new cascades that went online at the Fordo facility around the time talks began. But as Jason Ditz and Dave DeCamp point out at antiwar.com, that process was ongoing long before talks even restarted or were scheduled for the end of November. So I'll also say that the Russian lead negotiator in Vienna, Mikhail Ulyanov, seems to be, to some extent, rebuking these European claims and the American rhetoric by saying we should not rush to hasty conclusions about the deal's imminent collapse. And as I've said before, it's really disingenuous to act like Iran is somehow the deal can't be. There's no way to return the U.S. to the deal because of Iran's nuclear advancement, when the whole problem is they have not lifted sanctions and they have not stopped. The Israelis have continued to attack. The Americans have imposed more sanctions. They're still waging a brutal economic war against the civilian population of the country. And I have to say, it was very funny because, not funny, but just it's so hypocritical, I guess, is what we're seeing now, at least Reuters reported Thursday, is that the talks are on pause since last Friday. Now, they're supposed to reconvene. One diplomat said, they cited three diplomats. One of them said that talks would reconvene, I believe, on the 27th of December. And then somebody else said, well, maybe between Christmas and the beginning of next year, meaning before January 1st, but after Christmas, something like that. So now the Europeans claim that they're disappointed in the pause on talks, which is ironic to me because it's not as if Europe is under sanctions; the Iranians are. But I'll just say that Ali Bagheri Khani, the lead negotiator for Iran in Vienna, has said it's interesting because there's always this contrast. They're saying positive things about what's going on. They said, we have made good progress this week. We'll convene a joint commission today and continue talks after a break of a few days. Um, so, uh, I mean, let's see. And then I also found out in that report from Responsible Statecraft that it sounds like the Iranian hardliners, as I said earlier, are actually trying to cover their right flank at home and build support in critical areas for their efforts in Vienna to return the Americans to the deal and gain further support for negotiations. So it says here that Amir Abdul. Let's see. The foreign minister Amir Abdollahian. He's traveled to Hussein Amir Abdollahian has been traveling to the holy city of Qom to meet with senior ayatollahs to garner support for the negotiations. And so that seems to me to be sort of a mismatch, that the Iranians are also saying, as we talked about last week, that their proposals are now being reviewed. Here's another interesting thing. So today, Saeed Khatizadeh, the foreign ministry spokesman of Iran, came out, and this is a report that's fresh at antiwar.com. U.S. envoy for Iran warns time is running out on nuclear talks. This is what I mean about the mismatch. So you have Saeed Khatizadeh coming out and saying that the parties have agreed to continue talks built upon Iran's new proposals, which they insist, contrary to the American and European rhetoric, are not them, just walking back and being intransigent and rescinding compromises made under the previous government in the earlier negotiations this year. They said that, we changed maybe about 30% of it, but those weren't official to begin with. But we are building our new proposals on our nuclear obligations and on sanctions relief based off of the previous negotiations, and that they're willing to negotiate. And they've said they've encouraged the Europeans to have their own counter proposals and draft proposals, which I don't believe to this. I mean, unless you've seen something different, I haven't seen any reports about the Europeans yet coming up with any official documents to, have reviewed and negotiated. Khatizadeh says the parties have agreed on 2 new texts, the result of intense discussions in recent days in Vienna. These are documents in which Iran's position has been taken into account and on the basis of which we can continue future discussions. So maybe this is some sort of a negotiating strategy on the part of the Americans and the Europeans, because Malley came out today and said to CNN, at some point in the not so distant future, we will have to conclude that the JCPOA is no more, and we'd have to negotiate a wholly new different deal. And of course, we'd go through a period of escalating crisis, which is, of course, very aggressive. And he says if they continue at their current pace, we have some weeks left, but not much more than that, at which point I think the conclusion will be that there's no deal to be revived. And he says it seems very clear Iran is trying to build leverage by expanding their nuclear program and hoping to use that leverage to get a better deal. But again, as Dave points out, that they could only be talking about the only possible thing they could be referring to that has happened since they reconvened talks would be the stuff that happened at Fordo. But as we said, that predates even the scheduling of the talks. So their argument is nonsense. Of course, they've expanded their program, but everybody knew that. They did it directly in response to, like I said, the previous attacks. So the other thing that's interesting is there's a report from Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept that now we have a new statement from a letter put out by the Washington Institute, which is a think tank, as Jeremy Scahill describes it, as a militarist think tank. And now this letter is headlined by former CIA directors Leon Panetta and, of course, General David Petraeus. And Michelle Flournoy, who founded Center for New American Security, previously the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under Obama. These people have a lot of blood on their hands. Flournoy, of course, engineered the wars in the surge in Afghanistan, much like David Petraeus. Responsible for no doubt at least tens of thousands of deaths in Afghanistan. Also, Flournoy helped, and I'll say Petraeus as well. We know from Gareth Porter's great work on the Syrian dirty war, was involved in funneling weapons from Libya to Syria, and to aid Al Qaeda affiliates against Damascus, and Flournoy was helping engineering that war as well. So, but they're saying it is vital to restore Iran's fear that its current nuclear path will trigger the use of force against it by the United States. So they're almost echoing the Israeli rhetoric of the last several weeks we've been covering, that they want the Americans to come out and now, make really forceful threats of war to Iran, who they claim essentially are trying to keep an option open to have a nuclear weapon. I'll get into their quotes here in a second, but let's see. They argued that Biden must, quote, take steps that lead Iran to believe that persisting in its current behavior and rejecting a reasonable diplomatic resolution will put to risk its entire nuclear infrastructure, one built painstakingly over the last 3 decades. Now, we've talked about last week that report from Reuters that caused a big controversy. The Iranians responded to that said that, or no, it was 2 weeks ago, but they said that the talks, we talked about it last week, but they said that before Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, when he was in Washington, that the day before he arrived there to talk with Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, that they were going to discuss joint military drills to practice bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. We'll get to that again here soon. But now there was kind of an official ambiguous response, like John Kirby said. I'm not going to get into it, but we discuss things like that all the time. And so now they're openly calling for, quote, high-profile military exercises by the U.S. Central Command, potentially in concert with allies and partners that simulate what would be involved in such a significant operation, including rehearsing air-to-ground attacks on hardened targets and the suppression of Iranian missile batteries. This, of course, comes off the heels of Israel resuming practicing their attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, and they've approved a $1.5 billion budget increase to prepare for an attack on Iran. When Gantz met with Austin, he said, all options are on the table if diplomacy fails. Gantz called for military readiness and said there were even reports that said that he presented a timeline to the U.S. officials about when an attack would take place. Now, they claim that they're trying to force Iran to the negotiating table, as Scahill says, to compel it to reverse any efforts to develop nuclear weapons. And they say, quote, while the United States has recognized Iran's right to civilian nuclear power, Iran's behavior continues to indicate that it not only wants to preserve a nuclear weapons option, but it's actively moving toward developing that capability. So that's obviously not true. But the argument is that, of course, that they've enriched to 60% with the uranium hexafluoride directly. They don't say this, but directly in response to the attack on the Natanz facility in April. So they argue that, well, that's, much closer than when they were after the Israelis killed the scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in late November. They increased enrichment of uranium tetrafluoride to 20%, and that was done really to run the Tehran Medical Research Reactor, which provides, nuclear medicine and medical isotopes for, I believe, 1 million patients in Iran, where, frankly, there's myriad shortages of medical equipment and critical medicine. So, but anyway, they always do this. They'll hype it up like Iran is racing to a bomb when they've never done any such thing, and there's no evidence that they have. So, they are essentially saying that they have a latent deterrent, but they haven't sought a weapon. It's considered haram. The Ayatollahs, both of them, Khomeini and Khamenei, of bandits. So, This is just more propaganda. But I do like how Jeremy quotes Trita Parsi here. And he says, Donald Trump's military threats and broad economic sanctions are precisely why we're in this mess right now. To believe that more Trumpian conduct by the United States will break the nuclear deadlock bewilders the mind. Trump's exit from the deal and the lack of confidence that the United States will stay in the deal beyond 2024 has profoundly undermined the value of American promises of sanctions relief. The Iranians are hesitating largely because they do not believe that the economic benefits the U.S. promises will be forthcoming, and no amount of military threats will change that fundamental weakness in the U.S. negotiating position. So, yeah, I mean, if anything, that's only going to increase Iran's advancement with its nuclear program. Although I think the way I'm sort of reading what's happening right now, it seems like there is more progress being made in Vienna than meets the eye. Although I don't, but that could just be the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians and maybe even the Europeans, at least behind closed doors, are making progress, but that the Americans have maintained their status quo, which is essentially, as we've said before, we hope for a return to the deal, but as far as what we've seen this movie before, it doesn't look like the Americans are serious. So
Connor,
now, as
can
far
I
as
ask you about my favorite development in the past week was the seeming realization from Israel that, we've long known at antiwar.com, but I've been writing articles on in the past week, is that, look, this doesn't work, Israel attacking Iran, without the Americans doing it. And so what we're talking about is, Israel fighting Iran till the last American. So, I mean, but it seems that the Israelis have come to realize this a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that's important that, if the U.S. isn't willing to go along with an Israeli attack on Iran, that attack cannot happen. So if the U.S. isn't willing to do it, then something needs to be done to save the JCPOA, because I think the worst possible scenario really is the JCPOA dies, but Israel continues to be very aggressive against Iran. So where are all the details with this, Connor?
Yeah, so Israel has been making, as I've referenced and people have no doubt heard on the show, these, highly aggressive threats, essentially saying we're going to act alone, we're going to go to war, we're going to attack Iran, we're preparing for an attack. I already went through that, but now they seem to be dialing, as Jason says here, dialing back, walking back their threats. So there was a piece from the New York Times that cites they spoke with current and former senior Israeli military officials who basically, and there's been a growing consensus about this that has been reported on at Responsible Statecraft as well, where it seems like more and more even hawkish Israeli former, high up military officials are coming out and saying, look, we can't do this. So one of the things that they talk about is, like we said last week, that they claim they need they requested, Gantz apparently asked Austin for these 8 KC-46 strata tankers, I think they're called, the refueling aircraft from Boeing, because they need those in order to fly to Iran, bomb Iran, and fly back. Otherwise, they'd have to rely on aging aircraft and land in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And from the reporting I've seen, and you can imagine, that's not an appealing option for the Gulf states. Now, if I'll just read a bit from the New York Times piece so people can get an idea of what it sounds like. To your point, that there's a lot of quotes in there where they say things like, in fact, as Jason quotes here, Ralik Shafir, the retired general they speak to, says, quote, the only Air Force that can maintain this campaign is the U.S. Air Force. And if you look at the Times piece, they go, Iran has dozens of nuclear sites, some deep underground, that would be hard for Israeli bombs to quickly penetrate and destroy, Mr. Shafir said. The Israeli Air Force does not have warplanes large enough to carry the latest bunker busting bombs, so the more protected sites would have to be struck repeatedly with less effective missiles, a process that might take days or even even weeks. Mr. Shafir added, and they go, one current security official said Israel did not currently have the ability to inflict any significant damage to the underground facilities at Natanz and Fordow. And such an effort would be complicated by a shortage of the refueling planes. The ability to refuel is crucial for a bomber that may have to travel more than 2,000 miles round trip, and crossing over Arab countries that would not want to be a refueling stop for an Israeli strike. And then they talk about what I was just saying about the tankers, the KC-46 tankers. And also they talk about how if they tried this, they go, it would likely set off retaliatory attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, allies of Iran that would try to force Israel to fight a war on several fronts simultaneously. So yeah, it's this operation is not possible. They would need the Americans to do it. I don't think the Americans want a war with Iran. In fact, I'll be honest, I don't think the Israelis want a war with Iran either, because the phony Iranian threat, as we've talked about, it's the best excuse they have to continue to milk the American aid. And I don't think they want to kill that golden goose. And I don't think it would work out in there. I think they would suffer massive damage and casualties in that kind of a war. I don't think Israel would win. I mean, America might have. I don't need, honestly, that's a country of 80 million people. They've got incredible asymmetric capabilities. Who knows exactly how Russia and China would act? It's too big of a can of worms to get involved in. And I think that the Americans have known for quite a while. There's they're real hawks who are way out on the fringe, who even people like Dick Cheney or Sheldon Adelson, or even Mike Pompeo maybe, or John Bolton, who would want to see something like this happen eventually. But I think they're outnumbered thankfully by cooler heads, even in the military establishment. The whole mantra from the early days after 9/11 that real men go to Tehran was tempered by the massive failures in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like they want another major war in the Middle East right now. But so the Israelis are saying basically this seems like they're walking back from this, and the Iranians know that they can't pull this up. So there's a report here from antiwar.com where the head of Iran's military central headquarters came out and said, quote, any threat to Iran's nuclear and military bases by the Zionist regime is not possible without the green light support of the United States. They also, I think, in a message to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who they've been building ties with, particularly Saudi Arabia, but also the UAE lately, they said, if Israel carries out attacks against Iran, our armed forces will immediately attack all centers, bases, routes, and spaces used to carry out the aggression. That's another thing that they talked about in the Times piece, that they're concerned that if the Israelis did launch an attack, that the Iranian surface to surface missiles would destroy their runways even. So now the Iran carried out military exercises in southern Iran recently and practiced air defense drills or conducted air defense drills near their Bashir nuclear power plant in southwestern Iran. Yeah, essentially, as Dave just wraps it up here and just talking about like what I was just saying, that the Israelis have been claiming that they can act alone, but it appears more and more that is simply not the case. And Gantz recently spoke. Even Gantz seems to be sort of winding back. He spoke at the Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee, and I don't know. He sounds like he read or just stole and plagiarized one of the European joint statements. He just said that Iran is, well, actually, he says it's possible and necessary to put an end to Iran's foot-dragging strategy, sort of implying that they're not taking it seriously. And then he says Iran is coming into negotiations without real bargaining chips, which I think is clearly not true. Their expansion of their nuclear program they've been able to bring the Americans and the Europeans, everybody back to Vienna for negotiations, and the Israelis are clearly losing their minds over all this because they fear if there is a return to the deal, that, like I said, that they have a lot to lose because they can no longer use, to the extent that they have in the past, the excuse of the Iranian threat, which would be even, that's the whole point of the JCPOA in the first place, is to take the war that the Israelis are constantly threatening to start unilaterally, which would immediately draw the Americans into it, and it would be an absolute disaster. And that the worst neocon hawks and previously, I think the Saudis and some of the Gulf states would have wanted, but it appears that there's a lot of developments in the region. Trita Parsi just had a recent great piece you ran at antiwar.com as the spotlight called toward a new. Do you remember what the title of that is? It's Toward a New Middle East or something like that.
That sounds about right, Connor. I don't remember the exact title of that article. Trita has written like 3 or 4 really good articles on this topic in the past 2 weeks.
But so yeah, he basically talks about the everything that the bag. He compares side to side the American and the Israelis' Abraham Accord strategy of sort of building this, what they would call like a NATO style anti-Iran alliance, where they sell the Americans stage manage these normalization deals, or they throw the Palestinians under the bus and then sell a bunch of arms to countries like the UAE and Bahrain, and then they encircle Iran with weapons, and it's sort of built around isolating Iran. But these countries, now that it appears America's leaving the region, you see them taking missile defenses out of Saudi Arabia, and other actions. You see, they see the pivot to Asia, and so now they're moving and they're talking to each other more. And longtime rivals are negotiating, or not negotiating, but they're engaging in substantive diplomacy, it appears. So the real, and as we talked about, the UAE and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran, Turkey and the UAE, and of course the Saudis and the UAE are talking with the Qataris. They lifted their blockade. So there are things that are changing rapidly, and the Israelis seem to be trying to put their foot in the door and hit the brakes on all this. But I think the momentum is too great, and I think the Americans are dead set on really focusing on Russia and China right now. So in that sense, we do see some deflation in the Israeli rhetoric and the Israeli position. I think that's good news. So as far as that and what the Iranians are saying about the talks, I'd say that, when we'll see what happens when they reconvene and get back together. But based on the desperation that I can sort of, parcel out of the rhetoric, even from this statement from Flournoy and Petraeus, they sound like they're out of ideas. And hopefully that means something good is coming.
Yep. So, and it may be like a week before we learn too much more or so until the talks reconvene and everything. So who knows, Connor? Maybe we'll talk about something else next Wednesday on the show other than Iran. But if there's a bunch of big news, we'll certainly be back to talk about it. And thanks so much for answering that question, because I do think possibly America and Israel are waking up to the Iran reality. And if they are, that's very important development, because so far through the Biden administration, it didn't seem like they were quite a way to the true reality there. So Connor, thanks again so much for coming back on the show. We'll do it again next Wednesday. Everybody, he's Freeman's Mind 96 on Twitter. He's at the featured article section on the Libertarian Institute. And anything else to plug, Connor? Anything else going on?
No, that's it.
All right, well,
I'll see y'all next week.
Yeah, enjoy your Christmas, everyone, especially Connor. All right, see you, dude.
Happy holidays, everybody.